Hello, this is Ina, and today I'm excited to share with you my new junk journal, which I have entitled Douce France. The name comes from a well-known old French song, and it can be translated as Sweet France or Beloved France. The cover comes from an early 1900s book about French school paintings in the Louvre, originally gifted to clients by the famous Parisian store Au Bon Marché. When I first saw its softly faded colors, I immediately knew it would be perfect for this project. I have created a soft yet sturdy textile spine covered with beautiful fabric salvaged from a 19th century quilt. For the closure, I used 2 rings from an antique curtain paired with a piece of ribbon from an old hat maker's stock. And I have added this elegant and soft silk velvet ribbon to tie up the journal. So let's start this gentle journey through Douce France, a journal inspired by the charm and romance of France. To strengthen the cover, I have lined it with some rigid bookbinding chipboard, wrapped with this beautiful antique fabric with incredibly vibrant colors and graceful floral pattern. I have sewn the signatures to a hidden spine made of some antique ticking fabric. Here you can see another piece of antique ticking fabric, this time with a floral pattern, a page from an antique photo album, which I layered with some antique lace scraps. Here there is an antique millinery flower and a scrap from an antique letter with a wax seal. It's quite rare, a black wax seal. Behind we have very elegant and romantic lady picture. This is also an antique photo. And the page behind comes from a vintage book about lace. Here on this spread there is a pocket made of antique silk. I have folded it like this for you to be able to see the back of it. Here there is an antique postcard. It's blank and can be used for journaling. And envelope from 1937. And here you can see an antique book page, coffee stained, a scrap of vintage cotton fabric. Here I have created a tuck spot from some antique hand-embroidered lace, on which I added some rusty stains. I have tucked behind a vintage postcard of the Eiffel Tower, which was sent from Paris in 1933, I believe. And behind there is a fragment of a vintage love letter in French. Actually, the page behind comes from an antique photo album that I have coffee stained. I have embellished this page with some coffee staining and collaging, and I have added a vintage photo of a girl. And this page is a fragment of a vintage book jacket. I love its glossy feel and the lush and soft blooming roses. I have folded this page like this to create a small pocket from this side. Here you can see a kind of lining made from an antique book page. This is a very old book page dating back to the 17th century. This pink ribbon is a fragment from an antique bookmark. And behind you can discover some antique and vintage ephemera, including this blank postcard with the Paris view, an antique luggage label from 1920s, an antique billet d'honneur. This is a kind of award card used in French schools, And there is also a vintage telegram, which was sent from Paris in 1939. And here there is a journaling card that I made from a vintage book fragment. Behind there is a shallow pocket, and by the way, the lining is from antique ledger paper as well. These two scraps date back to the 19th century, and there is also a vintage roses image. The page behind comes from an antique French ledger, and for more texture, I have added this small piece of antique crochet lace. And here I have made a page of woven vintage paper strips. They come from a vintage ledger. Here there is another antique ledger page and a small pocket made of an antique lace sample book fragment with its lace pattern. I have included a small journaling card. Here at the background you can see some fragment from an 18th century French book, some antique bookbinding fragment. This tape here is modern. I have aged it. I will include below the link to the tutorial of the technique of how to do it. Here there is a fragment from an antique French book with this gorgeous serene statue. I have embellished it with some antique Alençon lace. This is one of the most rare, one of the most expensive and appreciated lace, which is often referred to as the Queen of Lace. Here there is another page from an antique French ledger dating to 1850s. I have also embellished it with a fussy cut, also from an antique French book. Here I have created a tuck spot from an antique book spine fragment. I have added a journaling card using an image from an antique French book, and this image is from a vintage book about roses. Here there is another fragment from an antique French book featuring this gorgeous fountain statue with the grand architecture of Paris rising behind it. It can also be used for journaling. More antique French ledger paper. This page here is also from antique paper. I just can't remember what it was. It was a kind of art album or something like that. I have created a shallow pocket. I have included here a fragment from an antique notebook cover. Here you can see still the list of the shopping list, like milk, bread, etc., etc. And an antique postcard. Here I have created a pocket using this antique advertisement card, and I have put inside a scrap of antique marbled paper and a small scrap of vintage film about Versailles. Here I have embellished this antique paper, which comes from a photo album, with some floral embossing. I hope you can see it. There is a scrap of antique muslin. Here I have added some more antique Alençon lace. Here, like this, you can see it better. Isn't it just amazing? Here there is some antique silk scrap, to which I have attached this page that I made using some acetate and antique papers. I will include below the link to the tutorial how to make ephemera like this with pressed flowers. Here there is a scrap from a vintage architect plan. Another fragment from an antique book. A vintage botanical book fragment. Here I have added some collaging using antique book page fragments, a fragment with vintage French posts. And here this is an authentic engraving from a book dating 1844 that I have further embellished with these handmade rosettes using also antique silk. Here I have created a tuck spot from a vintage textile piece. There is a journaling card with this gorgeous rose image from a vintage book, lined with some antique paper. There is also a vintage note with its gorgeous post stamps. Here there is another page from an antique photo album with some staining, some collaging. I have added this vintage child image and a lace scrap. On this spread you can see at the background a kind of ghost print of a rose, to which I have glued and then stitched a small pressed rose. And here you can see a fragment from an antique French magazine featuring a young violinist. I just love how this image embodies grace and quiet devotion. Here you can see the back side of this magazine page with this lady absorbed in reading. I have embellished it with a fussy cut of a rose from an antique wallpaper. And here on an antique photo album page, I have eco-printed an oak leaf. And here there is a scrap from a vintage document. On this side you can see more eco-printed flowers and leaves. And from this side there is a fragment from a vintage book about about Paris fountains that I have embellished with some antique crochet lace. Here at the background there is a scrap from antique wallpaper. I do not know whether the camera can show this lovely gold patina it has. I have added this image from a vintage book showing the grandeur of a chateau interior. There is a small silk velvet scrap on this side, a fragment from antique French ledger. And these tuck spots are made from vintage wallpaper. Here there is an image from a vintage book capturing a very romantic moment in Paris. I have added this fussy cut rose image from a vintage book. Here you can see the back side of this image with beautiful flowers. I will tell you more about this page later on when we see the most of this page. Here I have created a shallow pocket using some antique velvet. There is a postcard which was sent in 1926. This page is from Antique Ledger, on which I have transferred the image of a famous photo by Louis Hine. It is called Gamin Parisien, or Parisian Street Urchin. I have embellished it with fragments of antique lace. Here you can see some coffee staining and a fragment of an antique French torchon or kitchen towel. Here you can admire a very rare antique engraving dating back to 1841. It was hand watercolored at the time. I have plated its original silk protection paper like this in a curtain style fold. This is a scrap from an antique fabric and a vintage button. Here I have stitched a fragment from an antique tuile, and it is gathered by this piece of antique ribbon. And I have added this embellishment that I have made myself from a Bohemian glass bead. Here I have created a pocket from a vintage book page fragment with a fountain horse image, a fragment of antique lace with a floral pattern. Behind there is a scrap from an antique notary deed cover. Here at the background you can see a scrap from an antique photo album page, a tuck spot with a vintage rose image, and I have added behind a journaling card using some antique paper and antique lace scrap, and there is another antique paper scrap here. This page comes from a vintage herbarium cover. Here I have stitched a fragment from the same antique curtain that I have used the rings for the closure. And I have clipped here some antique paper scraps. Actually, these papers were used as kind of lining in an antique photo album. They were behind the photos. There is also a vintage envelope, and I have included here a scrap from an antique book. Here there is a scrap from an antique photo album, coffee stained and embossed. I really like this embossing. It looks like carved plaster work to me. Here there is a belly band from an antique French photo album on which I have added a pressed carnation flower, another antique wax seal, and here there is a journaling card on which I used a vintage image of Josephine with this ruffle made of a vintage lining fabric. Ah, yes, I forgot myself how I made it. These are two separate cards, as you can see. The one with the image of Josephine and another one with this textile raffle. More eco-printing at the back. Here I have added a fussy cut of a rose from a vintage book. And this page here comes from an antique directory of French chateaus dating to 1888. I have added this tape that I have aged myself. It's not original. Here there is a scrap from antique bookbinding, and here I have made a small bookmark. I will explain you the story. In fact, in France during Epiphany, people eat a special cake called galette des rois, and inside there is a small charm hidden, and the person who finds the charm wears a golden paper crown. So I got this crown once and I kept it I thought it would serve me for my junk journal ephemera. And here we are. I have created a bookmark using this Galette de Roi crown element. Here there is an antique paper scrap with some handwritten notes behind. Here there is a fragment from an antique book page. This page has multiple layers. The upper one comes from an antique embroidered fabric that I have tea stained. There is some antique black marbled paper and an antique embroidery pattern paper. And behind all that you can see some rusty stains on this antique photo album page. Here there is a shallow pocket from coffee stained antique muslin, and I have included inside this authentic photo with the year marked 1912. There is also an antique postcard. And as you can see, the page here is from antique notary deed. It dates back to, let me see, 18 something. So this is the end of the journal. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments. Thank you. Bye bye.